Hey everyone, guess what? We are here with the mighty Gene Hoglan, the Atomic Clock. Uh, he is currently on tour with Dark Angel supporting Extinction Level Event, which is that's like the first Dark Angel album in almost 35 years, right?
Something like that. Yeah, pretty much. Absolutely.
Holy shit, what a long time, but what a great album it is.
Oh, well, thank you very much. That's incredible. Thank you.
Uh, I didn't know this about you. I was talking with Daniel Decay. And he said, he's like, Gene plays guitar? I'm like, I had no fucking idea. Yeah, he played guitar you wrote, how much of this album did you write?
Well, probably about 95%, maybe, somewhere between 90 and 95%. One of the songs was written by Jim Durkin solely before he passed. And then Lara Christine, her style is all over this, absolutely. And she's got a number of riffs that are on the record too, where she was just helping me out, because Lara and I've worked together for 17 years now, and so she writes the best riffs I know, so her riffing style is definitely rubbed off on me. So that's a little bit of an influence there, and she definitely helped out with some of the riffs, and so that's where one thing, like for the possible next Archangel record, getting to really sit down with Lara and to do it the way that Jim and I used to do it, and Brett Erickson from the Time Does Not Heal era and I used to do it. Us both just sitting across from each other with a couple of guitars, just throwing around ideas and things like that. So a lot of this record is it written by myself, yes, with hands from Jim, hands from Lara. Eric Meyer wrote one of the songs on the record. He and Jim worked on it together, and so just it was just kind of, I just started working on the material and sending it along to the guys, sending it along to Jim, saying, "Hey, man, if anybody has any thoughts or ideas or any kind of anything, and especially Jim, because just he and I we just weren't able to like connect in person towards the when I when the real writing for this record really started coming together. It was towards the end of the pandemic, and I had a very tight window of schedule, so I just started writing songs, and I'd send them to Jim and just say, "Hey, man, any thoughts, or if you hear anything where you're like, hey, man, I got a riff that's going to go great with this, that kind of thing, just let me know, and we'll let's get together and get both of us on these tracks." But that was a little challenging to be able to get done at that point. So I just kept moving forward. And, like I've said many times, Jim and myself, Jim was my first like guitar hero, my first guitar sort of, just pal, guitar playing buddy, when back in 1984, 85, when I was first joining Dark Angel. And, I was just, really just kind of starting to play guitar around then. I'd only played guitar for a couple of years by that time. But Jim and I would get together, and we would work on what eventually became the Darkness Descends record. And so I kind of learned at his hands, at Jim Durkin's hands, that how to really write some kick-ass metal. So his influence on me has always been there, and I know Jim's style pretty well, and so I'm able to have his inspiration be a part of a lot of this material. And so that's kind of where that the impetus for everything started, was from 40 years ago, Jim and I getting together right across from each other with a couple of guitars. And I just tried to keep that sort of vibe going, even though Jim and I weren't together much in person for the actual writing of this. So there you go.
Yeah. Yeah, it's wild to think. 40 years.
Indeed. Yeah, man.
Well,
Absolutely.
did you think when you started playing with Dark Angel that at this point in your life, you'd still be playing Dark Angel stuff.
Well, when I started, I had no idea where the future would lead because I joined Dark Angel at age 17. But the one thing that I did know is I was pretty much 6 years into my goal, my dream of this is what I'm going to do with my life. Like when I was about 11, I thought, okay, I want to play drums, I want to play rock and roll drums, rock drums. And, I want to be on the road and tour and stuff. And by the time I was 13, I had really like, that's when I was like, yes, this is exactly what I want to be doing. I'm going to gear my life to becoming a metal drummer. Because by the time I was 13, 12, 13, 1980, that was the classic year for metal. Everybody putting out great records in 1980. And I was right there deeply entrenched in it right then, age 12, age 13, discovering all the great bands, Iron Maiden's first record. Yeah, that was just full on. That was that set me on a path right there. When their first
Yeah.
album came out, brand new record, nobody had ever heard of this band. The cover was killer. The the music was amazing, all that stuff. It was just like the heaviest thing I'd ever heard. And all the other albums that came out in 1980, from Ozzy's record to Heaven and Hell and everybody else, Ace of Spades, that was just a landmark year for heavy metal. And so that just got me rolling in the fact that that I wanted to play heavy metal. So when I joined Dark Angel, I did know that I'm going to have a career in the metal industry. Whether that's going to be with Dark Angel the whole time, I didn't know. But I've said it many times in interviews that I always kind of figured like, hey, this might not be your one and only band that you're ever in. You might end up playing with a ton of bands, and guys like Tommy Aldridge and Cozy Powell and guys like that, who were great musical journeyists. They move from band to band to band. I mean, that's how I grew up. Like
Yeah.
my favorite band, Tommy, and my favorite drummer, Tommy Aldridge, playing with Pat Travers over here. Then he's playing with somebody else over there. I admit I loved his Pat Travers era, and I loved his Ozzy era. Pre Bark at the Moon. When he came in around the Speak of the Devil era, that was a huge influence on my drumming. Was Ozzy Speak of the Devil because of Tommy Aldridge. So guys like that, Cozy Powell, jumping from band to band to band, that was like, okay, well, I guess that's just what you do when you're an in-demand drummer. Some guys were able to stay with their band. Some great drummers were able to stay with their bands forever. Guys like Rob Reiner and Rob Wacko Hunter was there until, from Raven. He was there until, he wasn't anymore, but, he was with them for a number of albums. And so, um, I kind of had the best of both worlds. If I'm gonna stay with my band Dark Angel, great. And if it doesn't work out that way, fantastic. I'm going to be around for a long time doing what I can to make a name for myself throughout all of this. So that's what I tried to do as best as I could. Absolutely.
Yeah. I'd say you've definitely made a name for yourself.
I appreciate that.
Strapping Young Lad and Testament and Death Clock. I feel like, almost anything you touch is just like gold. You're like the golden goose.
Oh, I appreciate that, Tom. Thank you very much. I've always tried to, like just elevate myself as a drummer. Really, that's my first. I'm going to put this iPad down, but it's you got this great. I'm looking at myself here and the thing. You got this light behind me. It looks like this crown of craziness here. Woo! So I'm just trying to keep that out of the shot. I'm here in a hotel lobby here in Yakima, Washington. So that's we got the day off to be able to do a little bit of press here. So if you're cool with this shot, I know it's not a great shot, but
Yeah.
Dave, what can you do?
Whatever.
Um,
I'm easy.
there you go. Well, thank you. Yeah, I just always wanted to leave a mark as a drummer. All drummers do, all musicians do. When you set out on your musical path, your musical journey, of course you want to be thought of as like, hey man, that guy was important to the style, the genre, the whole art, form, I
Yeah.
suppose. So that's where when I was a real young dude and I was, like say coming up with the drum parts for Darkness Descends, for instance, that was one where um I wanted to write beats that hadn't been heard before. That was always like kind of something I was super into because drummers like Neil Peart, like Tommy Aldridge, like Terry Bozzio, and a lot of the guys I was listening to when I was really young, the Bill Brufords, they were writing beats that weren't very common. They were very um, signature beats to themselves. Even Cozy Powell, for me, he created a lot of the double bass sort of maneuvers that a lot of other drummers emulated. So there, with those guys as an influence, it's like, okay, well, if you apply yourself and just try to put a creative thought behind what you're doing. And I freely admit, when I started playing, for me, my peers were Lars and Dave and Gar and Charlie and guys in this style that, it's like, well, Lars, he's got his thing. Dave, he's got his. Gar has his. Charlie has his. They've all each got their own signature sounds. And so I'm like, well, those four signature sounds right there, those are taken. Those are those guys, So try to approach something that will sound like Gene Hoglan as opposed to a Dave or a Charlie or any of those guys, So that's where applying some of the Tommy Aldridge isms, like for instance, if we all know Lars's style from Kill 'Em All and Ride the Lightning and things like that, and Dave's style from Show No Mercy on the all the way through the Rain and Blood sort of era, and Gar and Charlie, we know their styles, and so I wanted to try something a little different than what any of the other drummers that we were all listening to in my genre. Let me try to do, bring some approaches. So coming up with some double bass sort of patterns that other drummers weren't doing. I'd never heard anybody playing double bass patterns before. So you got a song like the intro to Darkness Descends, that's got a decidedly double bass pattern to it. That's kind of militaristic diddly diddly din, diddly diddly din, diddly diddly din. I'm like, nah, never heard that done before. Jab that in there. Death is Certain, Life is Not, also from Darkness. That's got some very pattern-esque on the double kicks, kind of some rudimentary sort of approaches. And so I was like, well, I'm pretty decent at that. Try all of those, which started leading to its, where the evolution of that, where start putting the guitar riffs over the top to match those double bass patterns. I play guitar, so I can play some crazy patterns on the double bass, match those up with the guitar. Hey, I don't hear anybody else doing that. Maybe we can make that a Dark Angel sort of approach. Hey, Dark Angel is the band that they put the crazy double bass with the crazy guitar chunks over the top of it. That's Dark Angel's move. So I tried that, and now that's canon for metal now. Every
Yeah.
band does that, So there you go. But these are just approaches where it's like just try to think outside of the box, try to think of in ways that maybe other guys aren't, and apply yourself in that regard. And you never know what's going to come up. It could be really cool or it could be absolutely stupid, but at least you're trying something. You're trying something new. That's kind of always been my approach with Dark Angel anyway. I'm not afraid to sound unlike any of the other bands out there. I'm not afraid to have our own approach because some people dig it, some people I'm sure don't, but
Sure.
we are always going to be a band that is in a constant state of evolution. So that is part of our evolution. We're okay if you don't grasp us or you don't like us or you prefer other bands over us, that's fine. But I listen to one thing and that's right here, when I'm writing. So
Yeah.
There you go.
Well, I think that's how it should be with, when you're writing music as a band, it's never about, or it shouldn't be about, we need to write the music that the masses are going to enjoy. You got to write the music that you enjoy or, that you're feeling. And I think that's where a lot of the authenticity, you know, c- that's where the authenticity comes in, obviously, and the longevity in a band's career. Look at Deftones. I think are, when they start, they're coming up on 40 years, I think, and everything that they do is different. Every
Fair
album has
enough.
its own sound. I'm sure people hate some of it and love some of it, but
Fair enough. Yeah, there you go. That's as long as you're just, I suppose, true to yourself, true to your own, wherever your creative juices are flowing. Like one year they might be this way, the next year they might be that way. But one thing I like, at least with Dark Angel, it's we're always going to try to write as heavy an album as we can. Like we're never going to go into some like, wait a minute, these guys have just lost sight of the whole program here. That's never going to happen. But with that in mind, I'm not afraid to, we're not afraid to put out a song like Off Time Does Not Heal, a song like Act of Contrition. On the new album, a song like Sea of Heads.
oh yeah.
Um, or Leave Scars, try a cover version of Immigrant Song where our vocalist Ron is actually Sean. Yeah, he's got some pipes on him. He can sing. That kind of thing. So, if you have the tools within your arsenal, why not use them? And if you feel confident enough to stretch out on your own path, carve your own path. I'm always got that kind of confidence. I never want to sound like anybody else. So, just myself, Gene as a drummer, I freely admit I borrow quite a bit. I steal quite a bit, but I also try to put back into the pot, a whole bunch of stuff, like I say, trying to write beats that nobody's written, have some approaches that nobody else has taken. That's where a couple of albums like Individual Thought Patterns or Symbolic, like those sort of come from that sort of approach. Like I I steal a lot, but I also try to put stuff back in that it's like, wow, I've never heard that approach on drums before. Double rides or whatever it could be. So there you go.
Yeah. Well, I think uh, there comes a point when everything can't be brand new, especially at this point in music and heavy music. It's a lot has been done. Not everything, obviously, because you're still able to hear new sounds and new elements listening to I mean, hell, Revocation's new album, holy,
Absolutely.
like,
Right. Revocation Rules, they're amazing. They are one of my favorite bands, period. So, that's a band that's constantly pushing their own boundaries. And I guess that's kind of the way, I suppose that's the best way to go about it. It's like you can't really pay that much attention to what all the other guys are doing, but you can look back at yourself. It's like, how can I improve? How can we improve what we have done in the past? Like that's all that Dark Angel really tries to do, because I'll freely admit we don't listen to a lot of other bands for an influence. I shut down all my outside world of listening when I started writing, the Extinction Level Event record, and I'm barely putting my toe back in the water to check out some of these other sounds that might be out there. And it's usually pretty safe to say that I do have kind of blinders on musically a lot of the times, because like when somebody says, "Hey, Gene, tell us what's on your playlist right now. What are you listening to now?" It's like, oh, whatever the next project is,
yeah,
like whatever the next tour's set list needs to be. So that's about where I'm at. That's pretty much what, venturing outside of Dark Angel music right now. I am listening to the death catalog of stuff that we got to be learning and playing, like that's coming up pretty soon. And I'm a little behind schedule on that. I started really early working on everything though. So that's where I've got a good head start, but I got to remain on top of it. And that is another thing. You always have to, above and beyond representing the band that you're playing with, you have to represent yourself, as well. Like I'm never going to show up and do a half-assed gig anywhere for any band ever, because
Right.
it's still myself having to represent myself, and I'm never going to have anybody go out there just scratching their head saying, wow, Hoglan really phoned that one in. I mean, we all have not the best perfect nights. Of course, that's every night for me with Dark Angel. I've only had one perfect Dark Angel show ever. That fortunately came about a month ago. But over the course of my, 40 years off and on of playing Dark Angel music, I've only ever had one like that was a almost darn, 99% perfect show. Yes. I've only had that once, 3 weeks ago, something like, but still, you do have to give it your all every night. You can't phone in anything. You can't show up unprepared, and that's because I guess maybe it is my ego says you have to represent yourself there, Hoagland, like,
I mean, I guess a little bit ego, but it's got to be, the pride that you take in the job that you do also, which I think probably starting out, a lot of people don't look at it like, oh, I'm gonna play music. It's a job that I have to take serious. Let's go get drunk, let's go get high, and then we'll go play and it'll be fine. But
right. And I'm fortunate in that regard because like my first 8 years in the music business, really, as a touring, as a just a musician working, playing, putting out records and all that. My first 8 years were spent with Dark Angel, and I was, like the young, focused guy. Like partying was not my action. It's at the end of the night, I'm in the back of the tour bus or the back of the RV or the back of the van or whatever we were traveling in at whatever time with the guitar in my hands, writing the next record, and going out and partying. And, that just, I had a goal. I had a dream. I had a vision. I'm like, I am going to be unrelenting at this until I get what I want, which is myself firmly entrenched and established in this industry that obviously takes a lot of work, I suppose to a large degree, a lot of sacrifice, but it doesn't seem like work or sacrifice. It's just you're following your goal and you're following your dream. And, my dream was to do exactly what I'm doing now. And so when I'm 17, 18, 19, my first few years within Dark Angel, pretty much my first band, really, applying myself. And I was like, if you apply yourself, you're such a fan of the music. You've got a pretty decent musical acumen in that regard. You know what's good. You know what's pretty shabby. And so don't get involved in shabby work. Like
right.
I've turned down so many bands where I'm just like, yeah, I know you guys are big. I know it's probably a good paycheck kind of thing, but I'm not feeling your music. So, I got to look at myself in the mirror every morning, and I couldn't really stand behind, Hoagland doing your style of music, So, that's where it's just like I'm on my own path, my own journey, and that's kind of about like back in the day with Dark Angel. It's like the next album has to get written by somebody,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
and usually it was myself and like Brett Erickson, my guitarist, like when Jim and I were on the road together. That was probably in the back, just noodling on guitars at that time. Yeah, totally. And Jim would join me when he would, and there'd be other times when, maybe not so much. But I've always been about just trying to keep everything moving forward, and that's what I do. I play guitar out here. I sit down with anybody who needs to go over riffs out here. I'm all about it. If anybody's got any questions on, hey, man, are we playing this right? Oh shoot, I'm not playing it right. I thought I had it right. Okay, well, I'm here to, let's show you how it's supposed to go. That happens. Absolutely.
Oh, sure. Like I think that happens to everyone. There comes a time, I can't even tell you how many shows I've been to where the guitar player starts on, in the wrong spot or on the wrong song and they're like, hold on, wait up.
Right? Yeah, that it does happen. We're all human, so there you go. And so that's where I've always tried to keep that at such a small scale for myself, like because I we're all human, of course, but that's why I show up prepared. I'm in so many bands, and
Yeah.
you got a lot of times it's like, yeah, you're maybe a hired gun kind of thing with these, but you still have to represent. You got to play the music properly, that kind of
Yeah.
thing, because it sure does drive people crazy when you don't play it properly. Like there you
Yeah.
go. So
Well, and you're getting hired to, even as a hired gun, you're
right.
coming in to play music. If you're not playing it right, you're not going to last as a hired gun very long.
That is very true, man. That is how it goes. Totally. You gotta know what you're doing, and you gotta show up being able to pull off what the job entails, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Not sure that.
I'll tell you, I really like that you guys didn't put Extinction Level Event on the streaming services, and it's available digitally for someone to purchase.
Hmm.
I like that because I feel like the streaming services, they take so much from the artist that it just you're you're losing what the whole, like if you take all the money from the artist, who's going to create the art?
That is true. And I do understand if the artists are like, hey man, we're just, because I totally get it. We'll put our stuff on the streaming services, and at least people will be able to hear us. I completely understand that. I totally get that. Um, and we'll, and that's where I guess 25 years ago, before there was, the spotlight on streaming, we were all kind of able to eke out a living through record sales and stuff. And believe me, back then it wasn't easy either,
Right.
and then the streaming services just made it impossible. So, it's kind of like you put your music out these days to in order to be able to go on tour and sell merchandise. That's really about the only way a band can sort of kind of, you know, exist. And now that has been made pretty darn challenging as well. The merch prices have gone up like crazy. You see it,
Yeah.
you can stop any band in their tracks and say, "Hey, tell us about the music industry. How is it challenging?" And they could give you a laundry list. Any band from metal bands to alternative bands to whatever kind of bands, they can all give you their own version of how challenging the music industry has become. And streaming services are, you know, they are you remember hearing about back in the 50s when young musical artists would sign their lives away. Hey, they gave me $50 for my music. I bought a sandwich with it,
Yeah.
kind of thing. That's Spotify these days, and that's all the streaming services these days. And I do understand where it's like, well, we can't fight the system, so we're just going to give into it. I I understand that. Who knows? Maybe Dark Angel ended up putting our stuff on a streaming service. I have no idea. But right at this moment, that's part of the thing that is also occurring right now is the fact that the streaming services just right at this moment in time are starting to alter their terms of use even more so
Yeah.
in that is drastically going even further against the musician, where they're like, we can, by you putting your music on our platform, we can do whatever we want with your music. I don't know that Dark Angel would be singled out to be like, hey, we're gonna rip your music apart and do all these crazy things with it. I don't know that that's the case, but right now it's just like, hey, let's bide our time and see what happens. Because it's definitely there's nobody advocating for the artist when it comes to Spotify, and
No,
some
there really isn't. I mean,
no, and they just don't care. So, um, that's the only way is if you get a movement started where, other bands are like, no, That's the thing. If all bands banded together, everybody took their music off Spotify. And for Dark Angel, of course, we're talking about the Extinction Level Event record. Sony, who controls our old stuff, we don't control any of it. We didn't put it on Spotify. We
Right.
didn't sign any contract to, we make nothing off that. So if anybody's out there, we're like, hey, why is Leave Scars, Time to Not to Heal, Darkness Descends, blah, blah, blah on Spotify and Apple Music? We had nothing to do with that. So that's where, if all these bands did band together, all the giant metal bands, and everybody pulled their stuff off, and that's where I don't, just to finish that thought, I would not be surprised if these streaming services would start taking it seriously. A little band like Dark Angel, a band like Dark Angel, if we're the only one holding the torch, I don't know that that's going to start a movement. A lot of people might just be like, man, we're cool to just, we spend so much money on our record and we know we're never going to see that back by putting out that album. Okay, some bands are in the position to be able to do that. We're never going to see our money anyway because the record label puts it up and we never, we get pennies on every album anyway. Let the record label go into debt. Dark Angel is our own record label. We fund every single thing ourselves. Every item of this band is funded from within, and from recording and all of that, what that entails, there's more to recording than just recording.
Yeah.
There's more than just, okay, the studio, the engineers, renting gear, getting hotel rooms, getting flights to where, all that kind of stuff. Everybody taking time off to record the route. There's all that. And then there's even more. So everything is funded by the band. Every tour, every plane flight, every hotel, every tank of diesel for the bus,
All the
every t-shirt,
PR,
all
everything.
everything,
Yeah.
everything. And it is, of course, you've heard every band say it's ball crushingly expensive. And that is one of the reasons, like, hey, man, I don't know what it's like to run a football team, so I can't really crab at Jerry Jones for what the hell are you doing with the Cowboys, man? What are you even thinking, dude? I don't know what goes on with it. So all I can do is go, dang, I wish we could win a Super Bowl finally.
Right.
And so I don't know the day-to-days of running a football team. I don't know the day-to-days on how to run a heating and air conditioning company and then installing HVAC machines. So I don't comment on it. And so that's where I stick to the things I know. I know about music, recording, touring, all that kind of stuff. And yes, we are in a new era, and we have been for the past 20 something years. And
I think a lot of bands are really moving to what you guys are doing though. Like you mentioned in the 50s, hell, the 60s, the 70s, the
right.
80s, that
Mm-hmm.
all the bands were like, "Oh, we're gonna go get signed and we're gonna be
Mm-hmm.
fine." And they signed the rights away. They signed all their music away. And
Absolutely.
and now it's like, "Holy shit, I did what?" You
Right.
know?
Yeah. When I remember back in the day with a lot of those, the hair metal bands, the cock rock bands, whatever, spending $250,000, $350,000 on a music video was that was par for the course. Hopefully your music video got picked up by your MTV. That's nothing I was ever into, but maybe you got picked up by MTV, and then that cost of that was well worth it. But band doesn't seem dime. The band doesn't see dime one until all those things are
All
taken care
those
of.
things
Back to the
recoup.
record label, and when you're recouping pennies on an album, you're just it's an endless cycle. And so the Spotify's and Apple Music's and all that of this world, they know they've got bands by the short hairs, because there are no other alternatives until the bands say, hey, you know what? We have our own imprint. We have our own .com. We're going to put our music on our .com, and the fans, it's there for the fans. If you're some if you're somebody who is not a fan of the band, you don't care. I get that. That's fine. But for those who are fans that are like, okay, well, this is how I can keep my band, and this band has turned their kind of, their business over to where I have access to what I want from this band, and I want to support this band. I'm going to get behind this band. Then we, Dark Angel with reverserecords.com, that is a way to, get the one-on-one going from us right to our fans. And anybody who has a comment about it, any trolls or haters, man, it doesn't bother me. It doesn't affect me. It's never going to make me change my mode of thought on things. Um, like I said, 25 years ago, when the spotlight was put on streaming, um, and all these folks learned about, by some of the things that were coming out in the press about, you know, we all know who spoke
La-
up against streaming.
Lars and
And
Napster. Yeah.
there you go. That's when that happened. And a lot of us who were in the underground, but we were just starting to kind of eke out a living. A lot of us were kind of like, brother, yes, that probably affects bands like you to a large degree. But for the most part, people don't even know about this. And now you're taking this big giant spotlight and putting it right on this. And everybody's like, wait a minute, I can I can get music for free.
Yeah.
What? And I've been a chump all these years buying CDs for that one song, and 9 songs suck. But I got that, now I can just go get that one song online. Like, it was like, brother, God, you're gonna ruin it for all of us. And that's kind of where that started. And so,
Well, partially, but all those and all those people who were like, Lars, you don't know what you're talking about, like back then, because there were a lot of people who were pissed that he was fighting Napster.
of
They
course,
look back now and they go, oh man, he was right.
well, he was always right, and that you knew he was right. But however, it was just like, man, that's gonna there's a lot of people that don't know about it right now, and I'm that aren't going to even know about it for another 6 or 7 years. Let us get this new strapping album out to where we can just kind of make a little bit of money back on it. And that no, that was out the window kind of thing. So, but
Yeah,
there you
pretty
go. But
quick.
but all the people that have streamed music and whatever you want to call it, stolen music, whatever it is, you might spend your whatever Spotify costs, $20 a month or $10 a month or whatever. Um, you can put that directly towards your band. If a million bands banded together and said, you know what, we are just going to make it so this is how you get our music, just by through the band directly. Um, you're going to get the music the way the band intends you to hear it, because that is one thing that Dark Angel offers, is we are offering the high quality stuff, the waveforms, the lossless, you got a
The
number of
FLAC,
different,
yeah.
all that stuff that you want to, how you want to hear your music if you're downloading it. And of course we have all the vinyl packages and the CD packages as well together. And you know, you're going to hear it the way the band wants you to hear it. And that's one thing that, everybody's always said MP3s are terrible. That's why so many cats are still into vinyl, because they're like, I can't stand MP3s, and the ease of listening to music, I totally understand. You want to check out what a band sounds like. Okay, you go to Spotify and check, okay, I heard that band. I know what they sound like now. I've seen their name around for a while. Now I know what Sleep Token sounds like, or a cool band like Midnight or whoever. You go check them out wherever and hear them. Or YouTube is another thing. That's why we have placed our stuff on YouTube, just so people can hear it.
Yeah.
Because that is one thing that I've been saying for months, is like, whether you buy our record or like it or don't like it, I just want people to be able to hear it. And so, at least we have some viable avenues with which you can check out Extinction Level Event. I'm proud of this record, and
It's a great record.
thank you. I've gotten a number of folks that are telling me that, and I appreciate that, because we put a lot of effort into this, and um, that's all I want people to do is just know that it's out, be able to check it out, listen for yourself, you decide, like I think it's a strong record, but I love it, but I'm not going to tell anybody else you have to love this record. It's our best album. That's not for me to say. That's for anybody else to go, hey, this is what I feel about that new Dark Angel record. Good, bad, whatever. I leave the judgment up to everybody else totally.
Yeah, well, everyone should have their own opinion when it comes to music. I think that's one of the things that we've gotten away from, and I try to really impress upon my kids is if you like it. Doesn't
Right.
matter what anyone else says or like my daughter's first concert was Justin Bieber and she's so embarrassed by it. And I'm like, but you absolutely loved him at the time.
Right.
Nothing to be
Yeah.
embarrassed about.
Yeah, absolutely. That was your thing. I get it.
Yeah, it's so wild. So let me ask you this.
Sure.
I think I know your answer, but what drummers would you tell people to keep an eye on right now?
Well, are you re-speaking of the newer crop or just drummers in general that everybody's known for years and years? Or
I'd say that the newer crop, let's say, lasts like 20 years.
well, I'm a big fan of, and I've said this many times for my drum son Ash Pearson, from Revocation and 3 Inches of Blood. Ash is my bro, and I've Ash has been a part of, you know, we've been a part of each other's lives for 25 years, really, something like that, pretty close to that,
Yeah.
maybe 2002-ish. So 22 years, 23 years, whatever year we're in now. So, there's Ash. And of course, there's Eloy Casagrande. He's gotten the dream gig for all drummers, and he's crushing it with Slipknot. And, all the Grayson Kreutmans and guys like that, and there's so many young dudes that, today's chops are much different than they were back in the day. And I no, that's one thing I'll admit with today's kind of recording technology. I never know who's a good drummer anymore, until I see them play. I see them play live, or I see, what really impresses me is when a drummer is not playing with his band. When I see him just pulling off something that's completely not being recorded, but a sound check or something, I can always tell instantly from a drummer. God, I remember doing a drum camp with a bunch of amazing heavier drummers. George Callias, Sean Reiner, Derek Roddy. We did a drum camp, a number of other killers. And I remember watching George, like he just sat at his kit for, there was going to be this big drum jam with everybody jamming. And George just sat behind his kit and I watched him play for 10 seconds, something that was so not Nile, not, it wasn't that at all. And it was so tasty and so amazing that I was blown away by George's talent. It's like, there you go. That's somebody, a well-rounded drummer, Yes, he's the king, one of the absolute legendary kings of the harder side of metal and the more aerobic side of metal. But the man can swing, the man can groove, and that's important to me as a drummer. I don't care how fast you are. I don't care if you do come from the, you know, a cookie cutter is not a pleasing term, but and that's not the one I'm trying to say. But if you're coming from a place that a lot of guys are coming from, show that you elevate past that, and that's what gets my attention. Somebody like Alex Bent, holy moly, what an incredible drummer!
Oh yeah. Yeah,
Ed,
now Alex did some shows for you with Testament, I think, in Japan back in 2014 or 15.
right around then, yeah, absolutely. And Alex was working with Eric Peterson quite a bit, and on the Dragon Lord project, and also when Eric was needing a drummer, because I'm always busy, and it was always challenging to be able to pin Gene down on, hey, can we get you for a weekend up to Eric's place? I'm like, okay, well, in 4 months from now, I've got this tiny little spot. And so just in order for Eric to just be able to keep working, he leaned on Alex Bent a lot. And Alex is a fantastic drummer. God, he's mind-blowing drummer, So all drummers are killer these days, like I say, they are like what we used to do, all the guys that help create the harder edge of metal, the harder edge of drumming, like kind of my class, my class of peers and all of us guys that help, put that on that. We drew from our heroes, and so those guys drawing from the fast double bass guys and the guys that have all the technical chops and all that kind of stuff, that's where drums are just elevating. The technicality is pristine these days. It is, a sight to behold at the speed and technicality and precision with so many drummers can play with.
Yeah, it's absolutely mind-boggling. I've I've seen all those drummers you've
Right,
mentioned thus far play, and one of the most impressive, like live drummers for me was Eloy when he
right,
was God, it was Sepultura and Testament actually
right.
in
Sure.
Cincinnati. Like watching him, he is like an octopus behind that
Absolutely,
kit.
just like this little muscle,
Yeah,
this human muscle, this tank. And so, yeah, he hits hard, and he's a killer, amazing drummer. So many talented guys, and so that's where when you see them do it live, you're like, okay, this isn't studio trickery or anything. This isn't where they slowed the tape down and played it at this thing, and then they speed it up to here. I've heard that being thrown around with a whole lot of projects over the years, and I never I never know what to believe anymore. I
wow,
don't, but
yeah,
I guess let me check you out live, and then it's like even beyond that, let me check you out just jamming for yourself. That's when I'm like, wow, holy moly, you're incredible. A guy like Flo Mounier, an incredible drummer. He's the real deal. That kind of thing. Yeah, so
Brian
many,
Zink.
so many killers.
So Brian Zink, I feel, is the same. He's got the heavy down and he's got the groove down. He can
Excellent.
kind of nail it.
Right.
He took over for Alex Bent in Battlecross
Okay.
when Alex left, and like,
Right. I remember seeing Alex's probably last show with Battlecross. I remember we were playing some European festival, Testament, and yeah, I remember catching that show. And then before you knew it, he was in Trivium. So there you go.
yeah, good for him. And now he's not in Trivium anymore.
Indeed, I got to reach out to Alex, see how he's doing. But yeah, he's a sweet, wonderful person, and
He is
such a talent. He will land on his feet and get whatever gig if he cares to keep doing this, and he will be able to write his own ticket. Absolutely.
for sure. So your next thing is you leave November 4th to go out with Death to All doing the Symbolic Healing Tour.
That's right.
Holy schmack. How are you like excited to get out there and jam?
Of course, because I love Death to All. I love all the guys in Death to All, and it's such a great time. And it's just it's just real relaxed, kick-ass vacation of touring kind of thing. Because we all got the chops to play the tunes, and that's always fun. And we never know where every night is going to end up. And our last run, which was in 2024, was the Scream of Perseverance tour, which was that entailed 2 nights in a lot of these towns. The night number one was Scream Bloody Gore and its era of albums, Leprosy and Spiritual Healing, and night number two was Sound of Perseverance with its era of the technical side of death, the individual and human and symbolic albums also being, represented. And that was such a killer fun run, it just it's always, there's zero drama on it. It's just always just really fun and everybody has a great time. And you got four guys that really like each other and our crew is always killer. It's just really kick-ass run. And we get to represent, our friend Chuck. We get to represent the music of death the way that it should be represented, like that's why I've always said, nobody is like death to all, because we will never just go, well, you know, we played on three records. Bobby, you played on Symbolic, Steve, you played on Human and Individual, and then Gene, you and Bobby played on Symbolic, and Steve, you and Gene played on, it wouldn't that's 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 not the way a tribute to the band Death should be running, like that's why we play the whole gamut, even on these nights where we're only doing single nights. We're gonna, it's Symbolic's 30th anniversary, it's Spiritual Healing's 35th anniversary. So, we're gonna play Symbolic in its entirety, of course, and we're gonna lean on a lot of the Spiritual Healing record for this run, but I don't believe we're gonna be, well, we just flat out don't have the time every night,
Right.
to play two albums in their entirety, plus represent, the other
The
six albums
rest.
in Death catalog. That'd be a 3 hour show for God's sake, kind of thing. So, um, but we're going to lean pretty heavily on Spiritual Healing, and since none of us were on it, that's kind of where I think it's okay. We want to pay homage to it. I We're all throwing around the ideas of how we want to represent it, and those are coming together, pretty. But we start that thing, and you know, not that long from now,
Less than
like
a month, yeah.
God, less than a month. And so I get off this Dark Angel run that I'm on right now. I get immediately into the studio preparing for that one, and and I've always said that I dig every single Death record, and not every record can be your favorite record.
Right.
Of the seven Death albums that are out there, Spiritual Healing was just for me, just in my opinion. I know a lot of people differ on this. That would have been my seventh of the seven records, in terms of reference. Um, and but it's a real challenge to learn. And I want to pay it tribute, like that's one thing when we were doing songs from Spiritual Healing back in the day with Chuck. I had asked him, I was like, hey man, do you care if I, kind of
Gene it up.
Hoglanize, yeah, some of this, whatever, fluffify some of this material, do a little something with it. And he's like, yeah, dude, you got free reign, man. Do what you want with it. And I tried to stick pretty closely to it, but I did get to have a few journeys on songs like, Living Monstrosity and Spiritual Healing Within the Mind or whatever. Even songs from Leprosy, like, Pull the Plug or Leprosy or Open Casket, any of those songs that we would do live. Chuck was always like, man, just, go sick, go nuts, do your thing with it. And so when we are doing like kind of the tribute nights, no, I do want to play as close to Billy as I can, and um at least on the albums that we are representing, I'll freely admit when it comes to representing the drums from Symbolic, boy, I'm gonna I'm gonna wing that. Let me tell you, it's like it's gonna sound like, yeah, I can tell it's the same guy playing it, but it's not every single lick just like it was back in the day. Because hey, I'm the one who wrote them. I'm the one who played them. I don't have to emulate them to every single inch of everything. It's like I'm gonna give you the definite, 95% of them, but I know that there's licks that I cannot figure out anymore. Come on, YouTube tutorials. I will definitely be getting on some YouTube tutorials of some of the young dudes playing empty words or sacred serenity or things like it. Does anyone where it's just like, what was that drummer doing? Like what was that guy thinking on that? Like I've said many times that for the symbolic record, you could have changed my name to Phil All Gaps because there's not any rest anywhere. It's like, why don't you just relax and just let a groove just set in place for a little while? Everything's got to be like all that stuff. And it's like, you don't think that you're going to be coming back to this record in 30 years and people are going to want to see play this album. It's like, you're not thinking about stuff like that when you're writing it, recording it, getting it tracked. And
No, not at all. It's so funny. It's funny to think about that. But, good for you for writing such complicated stuff back then where you're like, oh shit.
yeah,
Yeah.
well, there's quite a bit of stupidity in that complexity then, because I wasn't thinking forwardly thinking at the time. So, but I'm going to emulate as best as I can. But I've never tried to like, oh, let me learn my parts to the T like I would with a Sean Reiner, trying to learn Sean's parts because, if you're playing somebody or Richards even, I did my best to represent Richard and his brain, like Richard's brain. Holy moly, what do you think? I love teasing Richard about what was going through your mind? Was anything going through your mind when you were tracking, Sound of Perseverance? Um, I love Richard and I love Sean. Both guys are very talented drummers, and to emulate their styles, that's a real challenge. And it's no less challenging to emulate, you know, Bill Andrews on the leprosy and especially the spiritual healing. His drums were so different from album to album. I'll freely admit I really enjoyed leprosy, and I dug his approach on leprosy. And a lot of people, over the course of time, talk about the polishedness of that record. I didn't mind it. It's just it sounded like 1988 when it
Yeah.
got released. It did. It sounded like they tried to apply some. They tried to elevate themselves. Hey, let's try to, how do you make an album sound good? Let's try what it is. Nobody knew what we were doing back then, and leprosy might have had a crazy sounding snare tone, but I didn't mind it. I I think they kind of maybe I am spitballing here. I have no idea, but perhaps on spiritual healing they thought, well, that one was so kind of polished sounding. Let's go the opposite way and let's kind of make it sound very lo-fi. Maybe I don't know, because both albums they there's a sonic difference in both records that what can you do? But I'm gonna try to do Bill Andrews, his parts as best as I can and really represent, that album, the songs that we play from that album, can try to emulate those as best as I can and try to do the Death spiritual healing album proud kind of thing.
I,
So there you go.
I think you're gonna crush it though. Like
We will definitely crush. I know we're going to be killer. I do know that. And that's why Death to All is such a kick-ass band. I love Death to All. And so we're representing the entirety of just the concept of the band Death, the concept of Chuck Schuldiner and his musical legacy, the musical legacy of Bobby Coble, Steve DiGiorgio, Gene Hoglan, like we're representing those. That was we were all a part of these albums
yeah.
that help help shape metal, whatever.
Well,
But
they did. They really helped shape, death metal. I mean, death has a such a profound effect on music. Like I cannot imagine where we would be with metal overall without a death.
Fair enough. That's understandable. I get that, So just getting out there and being a part of that legacy and representing that legacy is an important responsibility, I guess. So
Yeah.
every night, boy, we're gonna bring it. And you know, we we record every night. We record everything. Just our front of house guy just puts it onto, whatever, 24 tracks or whatever. Listening back to some of those tracks, sometimes we sound like we are putting out a live record every single night because Bobby and Max are both so talented on guitars. They sound like just one four-armed guitarist, with that happens to have two brains, but this is all just one entity. It is so unbelievably tight every single night. So that's always the great benefit of playing with kick-ass elevated musicians. That's what I love doing. And that's one thing that, with Death, playing with Steve DiGiorgio. I've always said Steve's my favorite bassist. He's the best bassist in metal in my opinion. I get to play with another legend, Mike Gonzalez. Michael Gonzalez from Dark Angel. God, what a talented man that is. And he's always trying to elevate his craft as well. So I'm very fortunate to play with some really kick-ass musicians. Everybody in Dark Angels kick ass too. And so, but Death was my first time really like stepping out, like, wow, I'm I'm being matched here, by other guys that really take their craft very seriously, they don't take themselves seriously, but the craft itself definitely, so that's always really good to be surrounded with, absolutely.
Hell yeah, it is. So let let's end on I'm gonna ask you to give us a Chuck story, um, since we're ending on death.
Okay.
Do you have a Chuck story that you haven't told a million times?
Well, let me see. God, I'm sure there are many, we are reaching back 30 plus years for some of these. So, um, this, God, Chuck overall is, he was, of course, he was a complicated guy, and, that is one thing that some of his complexities were, like possibly due to what he was undergoing, physically and neurologically, but unbeknownst to anyone. That's kind of, and there's that new Vice show, the Into the Void, that just came out, 2 weeks ago, kind of thing, and that there's a one of the episodes is on Chuck, and it's worth watching. It's very touching, and I think it's a very enlightening spotlight on what Chuck was, what he was going through and things like that. They interview his family, Beth Ann and Christopher and his dad Malcolm. They're all represented in that, and that's pretty cool. But I just I remember there was one time when we were in Texas, maybe San Antonio, maybe Austin, and Chuck saw this guy who was, maybe he was, you know, a street person, perhaps, but he had a dog that he was mistreating, and Chuck was all about animals. He always used to say, people suck, animals rule. He would say that many times, and he went and saved this dog that, this very young dog that was, this guy was just kind of mistreating. You tell he was malnourished, and Chuck just grabbed him away from the guy. And we ended up keeping the dog on the tour bus for a day or two until one of Chuck's friends came to one of the shows to adopt the dog, and so that was where Chuck's mind was at, just like he saw an animal in distress that was not being taken care of, and he just stepped up right then and there and took responsibility for that sweet little puppy, and by the next day that puppy had a nice forever home after that, and that was a testament to Chuck's Chuck's heart He cared very much for animals, and you always see, you'd see the t-shirt with the cats, you always had a cat shirt on, and hey, it smells like cat shirt in here. But
Yeah.
that kind of thing. So yeah, Chuck was definitely all about the animals, man, fully. And he just liked having a real simple life. He liked working in his garden. He liked playing metal. He liked, tending to his garden and being surrounded by his family and his animals. He always had a couple of dogs, and they were always sweet, sweet dogs. He always had a couple of cats. I remember all his animals, Buster, Heidi, the Harvest, the cat, I remember all that. So there you go.
That's awesome. Animals, often I feel that we don't deserve them because they love us unconditionally, and some people uh, treat them like absolute garbage.
Indeed. And I tend to, I mean, to bring an animal reference into it, I tend to be like an ostrich you know, with my head in the sand when it comes to the mistreatment of animals, and I will freely admit, I'm not kidding. I end most of my nights in my bunk watching YouTube videos of kitties and puppies and bunnies. I've seen enough atrocity in this world. I've seen enough, of the gore websites or the gore everything. I grew up next to a freeway, directly next to the freeway that did not. This was before they had fences up.
And the walls, yeah.
The walls. They had a chain link fence, and every weekend, every couple of weekends, there would be a car that would fly itself up the freeway basically into my front lawn. Like I literally live next to the freeway. Like you could toss an egg underhanded from my driveway and hit the freeway. I'm that close to it. And there was constantly just burning cars, atrocities, you just all that kind of stuff. So I've seen that. I grew up in Long Beach, and when I moved out, I moved into the harder areas of Long Beach. That LBC you hear about, and so I've seen enough of the gore and the mayhem and all the gnarliness. That's why I'll end my night on something just really soft and sweet, and I'm okay with that. Totally.
Yeah, me too. It's not we've got three pit bulls, and when we go to bed, they are in bed. So it's nice just to have like, okay, here's
Right.
my little
There you
love.
go.
Okay,
Absolutely, man. Totally.
Gene, I know today was travel day. I cannot thank you enough for the amount of time that you have allowed me and the conversation that we've had.
Well, Tom, I sure do appreciate your patience with all this. I'm glad we were able to get this pinned down, and it's been a pleasure chatting with you, my man. Absolutely.
Absolutely. Well, maybe I will see you in Detroit for Death to All.
Excellent.
Uh, have a great night, man.
You too, Tom. We'll catch you soon, man. Thank you
Thank you.
very much.
See
We'll
ya.
see you. Bye bye.